The artillery was the branch under which Napoleon himself was educated, and it is therefore of little surprise that he prized highly this particular arm of La Grande Armée. To him they were the master keys that opened many a stubborn lock, though when one thinks of the various grand batteries that he put together in many of his battles, perhaps a sledgehammer would be a better analogy. The artillery formed an important part of his battle plans and were a perfect complement to the cavalry and infantry already discussed. However, despite Napoleon's often masterful handling of them, many of the technical innovations and even tactics used by his artillery were the result of work prior to the revolution. Therefore, in the following video, we will look into what these advancements were, how they improved the French artillery, before finally looking into how Napoleon helped to then unleash them upon the battlefields of Europe. When gunpowder, a combination of saltpeter, sulfur and charcoal, was first discovered in China in perhaps as early as the 9th century, it unfortunately wouldn't take too long for man to utilize it as a means of destruction. Taking in the early days the form of bombards, because of their size, weight and lack of mobility, they were used almost exclusively as siege weapons. However, their destructive powers in this role were not initially as great as we might imagine. It is significant that the first Western pictures of guns showed them in action against wooden castle gates, because for at least another century, gunpowder weapons in Europe were used mainly against soft targets such as gateways or houses. This was because the early bombards and cannon used by these medieval armies fired stones, but once iron balls became commonplace, the once strong and intimidating castles and fortresses became powerless to resist this new form of artillery. Walls soon crumbled and sieges that once took months now took days, and fortifications were forced to undergo major changes to combat these new events. Despite this improved success, gunpowder weapons had seen little to no use upon the battlefields, mainly due to a lack of mobility, but once truly mobile carriages did come about, their numbers rapidly grew, though their effect at this stage seemed to be more spectacle than actual damage. The roar of cannon gave the illusion of a supernatural power, the guns appearing as harbingers of hell, come to take possession of the battlefield. Warfare became terrifying, fighting men felt powerless at the mercy of luck. For this reason alone, all belligerents lost no time in increasing their artillery, the number of guns being considered of more consequence than their actual efficiency. In spite of the drawbacks of an ever larger and slower artillery train, armies encumbered themselves with more and more cannon. An important name to be mentioned in the improvement of field artillery was the Habsburg Emperor Maximilian I, who, in the early 16th century and after growing tired of his armies being slowed by their larger guns, split the artillery into two branches, siege artillery and field artillery. Further than that, he instituted a sensible organization. All guns of the same type had the same caliber. To ensure the balls were of uniform diameter, metal rings or templates were used to check them. At long last, these gauges enabled the standardized mass production of munitions. Maximilian I was thus responsible for many changes and improvements. Artillery owes to him the classification of various types of guns into categories according to their calibers, rationalization in the use of iron shot, the organization of artillery into an independent branch of the army, the promotion of gunners' training, and the mounting of cannon on wheeled wagons. Admittedly, all these innovations or improvements were matched in other countries where some were, even earlier, current practice. Maximilian's merit lay in applying them all simultaneously and methodically in order to make artillery a truly effective weapon. Although this was a promising development, at the start of the 17th century, and with muskets and small arms gunpowder weapons becoming increasingly available, artillery on the battlefield actually took a step backwards. As armies had become much more mobile, artillery seemed all the more cumbersome and its rate of fire ponderously slow compared to the crackling discharge of the small arms carried by the mounted or unmounted troops. The heavy cost of building and maintaining an artillery park appeared ever more out of proportion to its effectiveness. Only the heavy cannon were maintained for their requirement during sieges, and for the first decade of the 30 Years' War, artillery was very much a supporting arm, playing only a minor role. However, once the Swedish, led by their king Gustavus Adolphus, joined the war with his new army, things were about to change. Gustavus, like Maximilian, separated his siege and his field artillery, but he sought to make those for use in the field even lighter, to enhance maneuverability and to better keep up with his army. His first innovation, therefore, was his famous leather guns, where the barrels were supported with leather belts instead of the usual metallic rings in an effort to reduce the weight. These light pieces, usually no heavier than 4-pounders, were then distributed in pairs to each of his regiments, a practice that would later be known as battalion or regimental guns, to provide them with both fire and moral support. His other innovation regarded the artillery of the park. Firstly, he ditched all guns heavier than the 12-pounders for use in the field, and then he organised this artillery reserve into functional battlefield units, setting the blueprint for most other armies moving forward. In the Swedish army, as in other armies, artillery previously had not been formed into permanent tactical units. In 1623, however, Gustavus Adolphus had created a company of artillery, and by 1629 there were 6 companies that the king combined into a regiment. As well as grouping them for administrative purposes off the battlefield, on it he also grouped them into batteries to magnify their effect. Until Gustavus Adolphus appeared on the scene, artillery had been dispersed over the whole front of armies during battle. The King of Sweden, on the other hand, concentrated his in powerful batteries in the centre and on the flanks. Despite these improvements, field artillery was still very much in its infancy, and several strides had to be made both tactically and technically before it could reach its potential. These were early days in the development of artillery, and it could not then be regarded as a battle-winning arm. It is likely that the effect was far more moral than material. It was the custom to use the artillery of the park to carry out a preliminary bombardment of the opposing army over a period of some hours before the real battle was joined. One of the first tactical improvements was made by Marlborough during the War of the Spanish Succession. Although he didn't adopt the battalion guns of Gustavus, he did recognise the advantage of mobility when it came to the light guns, and it was on the battlefield that Marlborough showcased this understanding. At Blenheim, for example, he ordered forward a light battery which offered vital support in what proved to be the decisive attack upon the French centre. A similar thing happened at Ramillies, where 2 guns were brought up to support the Dutch attack on the left, and at Oudenarde, where delays enabled only 6 guns to pass over the River Scheldt, it was Marlborough himself who oversaw their placement, ensuring that they provided the support that he required. In spite of this impressive display of movement with his light pieces, proving how effective close artillery support could be, Marlborough still viewed the reserve artillery with as limited a view as his contemporaries. It will be seen, therefore, that at this stage of development, while the artillery of the park was still regarded as a stationary and not particularly effective instrument, the light artillery was expected to move during the battle and to provide close support from positions which changed as the tactical situation developed. By the middle of the century, however, this outlook was about to change with the arrival of Frederick the Great. Despite the Prussian king not being particularly adept in regards to the artillery arm, Frederick did make some key changes that would impact other nations going forward. He began by mimicking Gustavus and equipping his infantry with battalion guns, but the biggest changes were in regards to the artillery reserve. Although inspiration could be claimed by the Russians, it is to Frederick whom most credit with the invention of horse artillery. The idea was that the entire crew were to be mounted, or else ride upon the carriages, so as to enable rapid movement across the battlefield. However, his vision for them was, according to Hughes, not quite what we come to expect. Contrary to the generally accepted idea that horse artillery was designed to support cavalry, Frederick saw it primarily as a mobile reserve of artillery which, using its superior mobility, could be moved rapidly on the battlefield to occupy those particular gun positions from which alone effective fire could be produced against the targets of the moment. The first official company of horse artillery in its traditional role as cavalry support was created by the Austrians in 1778, but Frederick's use of them is still important. Whilst Gustavus and Marlborough may have shown the impact that mobility with the light guns could have, for the first time Frederick was using the reserve artillery as this mobile support. No longer being seen as static, he also began to concentrate the reserve's firepower towards the point of the enemy's line which he intended to break, thus paving the way for his attacks with cavalry and infantry. This was very much a foreshadowing of what was to come. Although not involving Frederick directly, a good example from this period which showcases this desire to move the reserve artillery mid-battle occurred at the Battle of Minden in 1759. In this battle, the French, having been induced to leave Minden and attack the Allied army, had formed up with their infantry on either side of their cavalry and 2 batteries of 30 guns on either flank to protect them. The Allied centre, through a mishap, had only partially advanced to meet this threat, and the 6 battalions of British and 3 battalions of Hanoverian infantry were doggedly holding against superior numbers as well as repeated cavalry attacks. Their light regimental guns were already engaged, but Prince Ferdinand, nephew of Frederick and commanding the Allied army, ordered forward a battery of British 12-pounders to help support this infantry. Here the heavy guns of the park were asked to move forward, and they deployed on the flank, pouring enfilading fire into the French troops before them. Their contribution was critical enough to draw praise and thanks from Ferdinand in his report of the battle, and it is a great example of how artillery, thanks to its increasing mobility, was beginning to justify itself as a valid independent arm of the army. Before we move on to discussing the French, there is a key development in the production of artillery that occurred during the early 18th century that should be mentioned. Prior to this point, guns had been cast around a solid mould, but this was prone to slipping and moving during the casting process, thus creating inconsistencies with the boring. To correct this, the piece was suspended vertically over a drill, which, using the weight of the barrel, was to create the correct boring. The problem with this method was that by relying on the weight, the drilling was not consistent and irregularities were common. Whilst this process was updated and the quality of guns certainly improved, a much better method was discovered by Jean Maritz I, a Swiss national, in 1704. Maritz, instead of casting the gun around a mould, simply cast it solid, and then horizontally drilled out the correct boring. He did this by rotating the piece about a fixed drill, and the historian Jobe asserts that this method became standard in France by the end of the 18th century. Maritz's children were to also walk in their father's footsteps and further perfect his methods, setting up or heading foundries all across Europe, their services being in high demand. Jobe concludes that this achievement probably represents the most important development in the manufacture of cannon during the 18th century, and this family business had contributed greatly to the development of pieces of artillery. This is probably an accurate assessment, because by creating a consistent boring, it allowed several other improvements and advancements in production to take place. Drilling produced a much better aligned bore with closer tolerances, which together with more precise casting of round shot of true sphericity greatly reduced windage, the difference between the actual diameters of shot and bore. Less gas pressure escaped, and this enabled reduced charges to throw projectiles with greater accuracy and the same velocity over the same distances. Lighter charges meant that barrels could be shortened and made thinner, resulting in a significant saving in weight. The lightening of pieces would form the backbone of the Gribeauval system, which we will get onto shortly, but this consistency in both gun and shot now meant that the charge could be pre-measured and also standardized. The cartridge bag, made from either serge, flannel, parchment or paper, therefore came into common use around the middle of the 18th century. Designed to disintegrate when the round was fired, it was eventually discovered that flannel was the best material for this. By this period also, the various types of artillery were becoming standardized. A couple of centuries after black powder was introduced into Europe, guns had been developed and specialized into 2 basic types, artillery and small arms. Artillery had split into 3 varieties, cannon, howitzers and mortars. The cannons were long-barreled and heavy, to take a big charge so that they could fire solid shot at great distance. Howitzers were high caliber, high trajectory, lighter weight, and lighter charge variants that fired hollow shot. Mortars were shorter, lighter weapons that lobbed hollow shot at very high elevations. Although mortars are categorized by some as being part of the field artillery, as far as my understanding goes, they tended to play little role in the field battles of our period, and on orders of battle and organizational lists, one usually finds only howitzers and cannons being mentioned. I may be wrong, and perhaps they did play a larger role than I am aware of, but from this point onwards, whenever I'm mentioning artillery, it is only to howitzers and cannons to which I am referring. When I eventually get around to discussing the nature of sieges, then I'm sure that is when mortars will come more to the fore. The French had followed closely the development of artillery, often keeping up with the various trends, and heading into the wars that took place during the middle of the 18th century, they were in fact regarded as having, if not the best, then most definitely the most unified range of artillery, thanks to Jean-Florent de Vallière. Vallière had devised a system of organizing the artillery, which not only cut down the number of calibers of cannon to 5, but he also standardized the ratio between the thickness and weight of the piece with the charges and shot. Whilst this was a major step forward, it was still far from perfect for several reasons. The first was that only the guns had been standardized, leaving the carriages and equipment to still vary depending upon the regiment, region, or factory of origin. Worse, despite the idea that the lightest three pieces, the 12, 8, and 4 pounders, could be used in the field, they were far from ideal. Consequently, although accurate, they were awkward for field use, and the army had a very large mobility problem in combat. Guns could not be displaced easily to support troops in trouble or at a decisive time and place on the battlefield. Many times, though the artillerymen were skilled and well trained, they were both outmaneuvered and outshot. The historians Lynn and Elting offer a good summary of the Valier system. It rested on the assumption that the cannon's ultimate targets were the walls of enemy fortresses, not the battalions. Designed for siege warfare, their tubes were thick-walled to take more powerful charges and long to ensure greater range. These characteristics made them very heavy. The tube of a 4-pounder in the Valier system weighed over 500 kilograms. He designed beautiful guns, ornate, long, strongly built and powerful, excellent for battering enemy fortresses or defensive warfare, but heavy and difficult to handle in the field. It was therefore of little surprise that the French struggled to compete with the superior and more mobile Prussian artillery during the 7 Years' War, and heading into the second half of the century, changes and fresh insights were needed. The Austrian artillery had likewise been humiliated by the Prussians during the prior War of Austrian Succession, and it prompted Prince Liechtenstein to develop his own system, bringing together elements from both the Prussian and French systems. By the time of the 7 Years' War that followed a decade later, the Austrian artillery under this new Liechtenstein system actually bettered that of the Prussians, though it would still prove not enough to defeat Frederick. Serving with this Austrian artillery, however, was a Frenchman named Jean-Baptiste Vaquet de Gribeauval, and when he was recalled to France in 1762 and tasked with reorganizing the artillery, he brought his experience and knowledge with him. Gribeauval felt that the keys to resolving the French artillery problems were absolute uniformity of equipment and the rational construction of all its components based on the manner in which the guns were to be used. The first problem that he saw with the current Valier system was that it was designed only with siege warfare in mind. Therefore, Gribeauval set to remedy this by officially splitting the artillery into 4 categories: siege, field, garrison, and coastal guns. Primarily, he looked at the field pieces, which were deemed the least suitable for their role, and which experience had taught him needed to become much more mobile both on and off the battlefield. Thankfully, the advances made in casting and boring by the Maritz family enabled Gribeauval, although keeping the same calibers as Valier, to design much lighter pieces, and as you can see from the following table, these new guns were in some cases almost half as light as their Valier counterparts, and yet still produced similar results in both range and power. Another issue with the Valier system was that, whilst the guns had been standardized, their carriages had not. Gribeauval therefore designed new carriages, limbers, and caissons, which were not only lighter but also standardized so as to facilitate the interchange of parts, thus enabling fast field repair and replacement. These lighter carriages also featured the improvements that he had witnessed under Austrian command, as well as a few ideas of his own. Gribeauval designed new gun carriages for each caliber and for the new 6-inch field howitzer. These gun carriages were built to take in both axes of recoil, backward and downward, hence the characteristic bend in the carriage that is more pronounced than on any other continental model. Valier denied artillerists the use of even the simplest aiming instruments. Gribeauval provided crews with graduated rear sights and an elevating screw at the breech, which allowed for much more accurate fire. In order to pull this new equipment, Gribeauval had designed it to be drawn by horses in tandem, 4 for the 4 and 8 pounders and 6 for the 12 pounder. He also introduced bricoles for when the piece needed to be moved by manpower alone. The bricole consisted of a leather strap, a trace rope, and an iron hook. Prior to this, ropes were simply tied to the gun and the men pulled on them, but because the leather strap attached to the body, the bricoles enabled men to use their full body weight and strength to move the pieces, greatly improving mobility. Also under the Gribeauval system, a double trail handspike was introduced, which, combined with the excellent balance of the gun carriages, enabled one man to traverse a piece. One potential drawback in these new carriages, however, was that the guns had both a fire position and a travel position for the barrel, and switching between the two when either limbering or unlimbering required time and manpower. There is a debate as to how much of an inconvenience this actually was, with some historians believing that the operation took only moments, with others believing it to take much longer, especially with the heavier calibers. Gribeauval, somewhat in response to this problem, but also aware that limbering and unlimbering generally took time with any gun, proposed quite a novel solution, and that was the prolonged system. This was a simple tool for use in combat in order to speed up the maneuvers of artillery in the field. The idea was that, during battles in this new age of maneuver, a gun may be required to move position, perhaps several times. Usually this would involve attaching the gun to the limber, moving to the new position, and then unlimbering the gun once again. Gribeauval, however, suggested that once the gun is deployed for action, then an 8-meter long rope or prolong be attached between the gun and the limber. The length would mean that it did not impede operations, but should the gun be required to move, then the limber could simply move off and the gun would be dragged along behind it. Of course, this method couldn't be used for travelling far, nor was it advisable over rough terrain, but most historians seem to agree that it was used throughout the Napoleonic period by the French and offered a good time save on the battlefield. It was also useful for quick withdrawals, enabling the gunners to fire until the very last moment before retreating, the need to limber up not being necessary. Whilst these changes all looked at improving manoeuvrability, Gribeauval also had in mind to improve the gun's rate of fire, which he did by introducing fixed ammunition. With the cartridge bag already in use, a Frenchman named Lieutenant General Brocard in the 1740s took it a step further by attaching the bag to both the round and a wooden sabot, thus creating a fixed round. The sabot was designed to stabilize the round when fired, reducing windage and improving muzzle velocity, but the main advantage of this fixed ammunition is obvious. It meant that the gun team only had to load and ram one item as opposed to two. Despite the clear improvements that Gribeauval's system offered, it was not at first universally accepted, and it actually led to division amongst French military circles. The change from the Valliere to Gribeauval's system came only after considerable controversy. Debate rose to such a pitch because the choice of guns rested upon important tactical assumptions, and these attracted most of the attention. Those who believed in the preeminence of siege warfare and trusted to counter battery fire on the battlefield favoured the Valliere system and became known as the Reds. Partisans of Gribeauval's field artillery thought more of battle and identified the enemy's troops as targets of choice for the artillery. They were called Blues. The Blues had their way in 1765 when the army adopted the Gribeauval system. 7 years later, the Reds turned the tables on the Blues as the new system was rejected, but in 1774, Gribeauval's guns, with some modifications, won final acceptance. With the new system finally in place, military minds could begin to focus their attention upon the tactics which these new guns should employ. This was the situation when Guibert published the Essai Général. It was the first of the great military works to deal with artillery, which in itself is revealing, as the previous writers apparently did not feel that its influence upon tactics was great enough to concern them. Guibert's work was the first, moreover, to appear after the adoption of Gribeauval's reforms. Although perhaps more famous for his work on infantry and grand tactics, Guibert nonetheless raised some important points about artillery, and considering that his essay was general reading for most of the Napoleonic French officers, it is worth looking into some of his thoughts. Guibert described artillery as the third arm of the army. More properly speaking, he said, it was an accessory to the army, since, unlike the other two, it could not fight alone. In keeping with his general belief in regards to warfare, Guibert desired movement for the artillery, which is why he applauded the new lighter guns brought in by Gribeauval. He stressed the need for the artillery to support the infantry, and therefore it should be able to move and keep up with them. However, one area in which Guibert was critical and not forward-thinking was in his outlook on the number of artillery to be used. He felt that too many guns encumbered an army, slowing their march and creating supply issues that ultimately led to static warfare. Guibert was perhaps foreseeing the static trench warfare of the First World War, but more likely he was simply wrong in this area. Though his intentions to keep the army mobile were sound and admirable, the wars that followed would show that increasing one's artillery did not impede manoeuvrability. However, Guibert did understand the true purpose of artillery, and that was a concentration of firepower. The purpose of artillery ought not to be to kill some men along the whole of the enemy's front. It ought to be to overthrow or destroy parts of the front, either about the points from which he can attack most advantageously, or about the points where he can be attacked with the most advantage. These thoughts were to also inspire the writings of another military mind, who would, like Guibert, go on to have a huge influence on the tactical thinking of Napoleon, and that was Guibert and Du Teil, who, in 1778, published his book De l'usage de l'artillerie nouvelle dans la guerre de campagne. Jean's elder brother, Joseph, would actually teach Napoleon at the Auxion Artillery School in 1788, and no doubt the ideas of Jean were passed on to the future emperor, along with, I imagine, a copy of this book. In it, Du Teil mirrors Guibert in strongly advocating for mobility in warfare, but where the two minds divide is in their outlook upon the number of artillery. Whilst Guibert wanted to limit the number so as to keep it in a supporting role and thus maintain manoeuvrability, Du Teil felt that this was backwards thinking, and argued that more guns could now be added to an army without impeding it, all thanks to the technical improvements that the Gribeauval system provided. Du Teil recognized that the great improvement which had been carried out in the artillery enabled it to take its place as a fully independent arm. In terms of operating the guns, Du Teil wrote about the advantages of ricochet fire, the formation of batteries, and he stressed that the targets should be the enemy troops and not the artillery, and preferably an enfilading fire would be used to inflict as much damage as possible. Although they may have disagreed on the numbers of artillery to be used, Du Teil's most famous quotations from the work actually echo the thoughts of Guibert, and clearly had a huge influence upon Napoleon and other French artillery officers. It is necessary to multiply the artillery on the points of attack which ought to decide the victory, relieving the batteries which had suffered, replacing them by others, without the enemy's being able to notice it, not to prevail from an advantage which redoubles his ardour and discourages your troops. The artillery thus sustained and multiplied with intelligence procures decisive results. The victory which the artillery has prepared then depends only upon the courage of the troops. The idea was simple, to concentrate the fire of the artillery upon the point at which you wish to attack, and then, once weakened, that point will be consolidated by infantry. This is, in an extremely simplistic form, the foundation of Napoleonic warfare. Being in some ways a scientific corps, the artillery arm was actually looked upon fondly by the Revolution, and although still hurt, it saw less of its officers lost to the flight of the émigrés than either the cavalry or infantry. It was also finally formed into an independent arm on the 28th of October 1790 and administered by its own artillery committee, putting it on equal footing to the other two arms. Therefore, heading towards the opening of hostilities in 1792, the French undoubtedly had one of the best equipped and organized artillery arms in all of Europe, and the Revolution only helped to bolster an already proud esprit de corps existing within it. The 7 regiments, each divided into 2 battalions of 10 companies, exchanged their name in favour of a number. All soldiers became gunners, and the seconds in command would henceforth have the more important sounding title of second officers. This revolutionary spirit also revived an older practice. The previously discredited and abandoned idea of keeping a pair of 4-pounder guns in each battalion was revived for the National Guards from September 1791, then taken with them into the volunteer infantry and finally extended to the line infantry in February 1793. The return of battalion guns was obviously a step away from the tactical theories of Du Teil, and although they had been deemed ineffective in terms of damage output by French military authorities in the previous decades, their return was a major morale boost for the new volunteers on the battlefield, which in truth had always been their main contribution anyway. The biggest change, however, was that France finally formed her own horse artillery in January 1792, and their success was immediate, sparking a rapid growth that would see them reach a peak strength of 54 companies in just over 2 years. A reason for this, as well as for their burgeoning popularity, was that they seemed to capture the revolutionary spirit, showing both dare and aggression on the battlefield. Perhaps this was because half of their recruits were from the cavalry, but regardless, the mobility granted by having the entire company mounted meant that they could keep pace with even the advance guard of the army, and they would therefore attempt to take part in any action that they could find, no matter how small. They would often deploy as close to the enemy as possible, usually just out of effective musket range, unlimber their cannon, and provide close-range fire support for the appreciative infantry. In his study on the Armée du Nord from 1792 to 94, Lynn states that, "To say that the artillery dominated battle along the Belgian frontier would rob the infantry of its hard-won glory. Still, the Armée du Nord owed much to its gunners." And, throughout the campaigns of 1792-94, the horse artillery performed marvels. However, their introduction was not as smooth as it appears, and despite their impact, they were not without problems. Firstly, they were not easy nor cheap to both form and maintain in the field. Apart from its 6 guns, each battery needed some 144 horses and at least 74 men equipped and armed as cavalry, together with a leavening of civilian drivers. A battery would therefore comprise as many men and horses as a cavalry squadron. Secondly, their popularity meant that many of the best recruits from the foot artillery left to join this new and exciting horse branch, leaving the former in a much worse state. In the end, though, their impact on the battlefield appeared to make up for any downsides. The greater investment paid dividends in batteries that took a far more active part in full-scale battles, and whose flexibility made them a decisive presence in small actions. To sum up the French artillery's performance during the Revolutionary Wars, the best term would probably be mixed. The horse artillery had proved to be a revelation, showcasing the same daring and aggression that would become a hallmark of the French artillery going forwards, and their mobility was often utilised wisely, enabling them to provide timely and critically placed close-range support for the other arms. However, the performance of the foot and battalion artillery was not as impressive, and although there were exceptions, very often their tactical use ignored the teachings of Guibert and Du Teil, too often spreading out their consequentially ineffective fire. One man who had begun to embrace these new philosophies was of course Napoleon, who proved his complete understanding of the arm at Toulon before generalship of the Army of Italy in 1796 allowed him to arrange the artillery how he saw fit, giving each division its own foot and horse artillery, a foreshadowing of what was to come. However, despite the success of this much lauded first Italian campaign and the marvels that the Army of Italy performed under his command, once Napoleon became first consul in 1800, he immediately began a series of military reforms designed to shape the French army into la Grande Armée. One of the early changes that he made to the artillery was the creation of the train d'artillerie. During the times of the Ancien Regime and throughout the Revolutionary Wars, French artillery had been hauled by civilian drivers under contract. Although there are examples of them doing a good job, generally they were unreliable, particularly in combat, and it is unsurprising that Napoleon sought to rectify this by turning them into professional soldiers. Given a uniform, carbine, pistol, and short infantry sword, they soon developed an esprit de corps, and this was further enhanced when they were permanently paired with an artillery company, creating a bond between the two. Long service together hammered the two organizations into a homogeneous outfit. The train company commander was the subordinate to the artillery company commander, which is why the former was usually a lieutenant. This was an important change by Napoleon, for the artillery train was paramount for ensuring that the artillery was in the right place at the right time, and professionalization certainly improved things. Napoleon estimated that the creation of the train d'artillerie saved him 2 million francs a year. There can be no doubt that it was a highly efficient organization. Men and horses were picked and trained with care. The Grand Armée might go hungry, but it never quite ran out of ammunition, even in the depths of Russia. Although Napoleon had been educated in the Gribeauval system and had already proved its effectiveness in battle, he was not content, being all too aware of its faults. Gribeauval had made parts interchangeable within calibers, not within the entire system. Wheels for the light 4-pounder, for example, could not be used on the 8 or 12-pounder. There was a different limber for the 4-pounder than for the other two calibers, though theirs was the same. Carriages for all 3 guns were different. Caissons for the 8 and 12-pounders were the same, but that for the 4-pounder was of a different size. Napoleon, therefore, in 1800, set up a committee to investigate the state of the artillery and to suggest any improvements. Headed by Marmont and Elbe, their solution was to be the system of the year 11, which proposed simplifications and improvements designed to further enhance the mobility of the artillery in the field. To aid the interchangeability of the various parts, the carriages, limbers, and caissons were all redesigned and would require only 8 separate sizes of wheels, as opposed to the 25 under Gribeauval. Another issue with the Gribeauval guns was that, because of the balance setup, the barrels had 2 positions on the carriage, one for travel and one for action, and obviously switching between the two was necessary in order to serve and move the guns. To solve this, as well as to simplify calibers even further, the new system replaced the 4-pounder, deemed too light, and the 8-pounder, deemed impractical, with a 6-pounder, a caliber already in use by most other nations, and would therefore allow captured pieces and ammunition to be used alongside this newly designed cannon. The Revolutionary Wars at this point had already netted the French many Austrian guns of this caliber, which were to be immediately put to use. They also believed that the 6-inch howitzer was too heavy, requiring too many horses, and that it should be replaced by a more mobile 5.5-inch version. There was an added benefit to this change because, although the 5.5-inch howitzer could not match the performance in some areas of its 6-inch predecessor, its caisson could now carry 75 rounds instead of the previous 50, and it additionally only required 2 powder charges to the 6-inch's 3, thus saving precious powder. The committee did maintain the famous 12-pounder, but recommended a new carriage with improved stability and more accentuated skids which offered better recoil, as well as enabling the piece to be more easily dragged. Therefore, the only calibers in this new system for use in the field were to be the 6 and 12-pounder cannon and a 5.5-inch howitzer. Although Napoleon approved of these changes, the complete overhaul that he dreamed of was not to become a reality. At the same time, the program to replace the Gribeauval artillery vehicles made little headway. The constant wars forced their continued use, and mixing them with new models merely increased the spare parts problem. Therefore, in reality, the French artillery during the period was a continuous mix of both the Gribeauval system and the system of the year 11, as well as a healthy number of captured enemy pieces being added to their ever-growing arsenal. A great example of this comes from the Jena campaign in 1806. Soult's 4th Corps set out with 42 out of 48 of their cannon being of Austrian origin, and Davout's 3rd Corps was still completely equipped with Gribeauval guns, the 3 foot companies each containing 5 8-pounders and a 6-inch howitzer, whilst the 4-pounder was the only caliber possessed by the horse artillery. Although occurring after our period, it is worth noting that this mix and match practice would eventually lead to a compromise. Napoleon set up a new commission in 1810, headed by General Nicolas Sanguy, that finally decided that the système en onze was neither practical nor suitable for adoption, and a decision was made to keep the Gribeauval system, but augment it with the new 6-pounder and 5.5-inch howitzer. However, returning to these early reforms, Napoleon also turned his attention towards the battalion guns of the infantry. Their main value lay in boosting the morale of shaky infantry, even though they may also at times have slowed down its movements. They certainly consumed up to 22 horses per battalion, which might have been better employed on other tasks. Whilst Napoleon would have been acutely aware of the boost in morale, he in fact bemoans their loss towards the end of our period and brings them back for the campaign on the Danube in 1809. The shortage of horses across the army was likely what persuaded Napoleon to disband the battalion guns, and most of them went into stores. With war looming and Napoleon's preferences and improvements being put into practice, let us then look into the, on paper at least, organisation of the artillery of La Grande Armée. Heading into the Ulm campaign in 1805, the artillery arm was split into several areas. We will look into each in turn, but focusing primarily on the horse and foot artillery. There were also units for coastal and fortress defence, but as these don't concern La Grande Armée directly, and for want of time, I won't be discussing them. The foot artillery were the main branch of the arm, comprising most of the men and guns, as well as housing all of the heavier field pieces. They were organised into 8 regiments, each of which contained 22 companies. This organisation into regiments was merely for administration purposes, for most regiments would see their companies scattered across different regions and attached to different corps and armies, particularly as the Napoleonic Wars expanded to multiple fronts. In 1812, the 3rd Regiment d'Artillerie à Pied had 9 companies in Spain, divided among the armies of Andalusia, the Centre, and Portugal. 3 at Toulouse, 2 at Figueras, and 1 each at Madrid, Barcelona, Lyon, La Pointe de Grave, the Ile de Ré, Flushing, Antwerp, and Breda. Each company comprised of 4 officers and 116 gunners who were armed with a musket, ideally the short dragoon or artillery pattern, as well as a briquette, which was the short infantry sword, and a bayonet. These 120 men were to operate 8 guns, made up usually in one of 2 combinations. Most common was with 6 6-pounders and 2 5.5-inch howitzers, but they could also be equipped with 6 12-pounders and 2 6-inch howitzers. This was the theory, of course, and on campaign, losses would reduce this, and during La Grande Armée period, as we saw in the examples above with Sultan Davut's corps in 1806, the Gribeauval models were still common, as was the use of captured enemy pieces. Each of these guns would be towed using a limber, which in most armies also housed a small ammunition chest, but under the Gribeauval system, this ammunition chest was actually positioned on the gun trails. The historian von Pivka is very critical of this arrangement. This had 2 disadvantages. Firstly, the ammunition thus carried was very limited, and secondly, limbering and unlimbering were complicated by the need to remove and replace the chest. Although these criticisms are certainly valid, the idea of having ammunition immediately available with the gun, and not just a limber, did have its advantages in certain scenarios, even if there wasn't much of it. For reference, the amount of ammunition carried in this small chest varied depending upon the caliber of the gun, and as a comparison you can see how much more ammunition was held in the limbers of other nations. The remainder of the ammunition was therefore carried in caissons, specially designed wagons with waterproof compartments ensuring that the charges were kept adequately dry. The French system had 2 sizes of caisson, one for use with the 12, 8 and 6-pounders, and the other for use with the 4-pounders. Again, the amount of ammunition stored in these caissons varied, with smaller guns obviously allowing for more ammunition to be stored. As noted earlier, the switch from the 6-inch to the 5.5-inch howitzer increased the available ammunition for the gun, and no doubt this was also another of the reasons for the recommendation for the switch from the 8-pounder to the 6-pounder cannon. With Napoleon desiring lots of ammunition for his artillery, the various calibers would need numerous caissons to provide this, with the 12-pounder requiring 5, the 8 and 6-pounders requiring 3, whilst the 4-pounder required 2. Remember, this is per gun, and simply as a comparison, you can see how much ammunition similar or equivalent calibers of other nations' guns would carry on campaign. As if these caissons were not enough, each company would also possess 3 wagons containing tools and spare parts, a field forge, and when attached to infantry divisions, 4 extra caissons loaded with musket cartridges. Therefore, with 8 guns and limbers and upward of about 30 wagons and caissons, a foot artillery company was quite large. Pulling all of these various vehicles, however, was the job of the artillery train, as aside from potentially the officers, foot regiments had no horses of their own, and the gunners were expected to simply march alongside their guns. The French artillery companies themselves were brigaded with a train company that hauled the vehicles and guns. Horses and harnesses belonged to the train company, and the guns and vehicles to the artillery company. For reference, here is a table of the number of horses required for the pulling of each gun and caisson depending upon the caliber. As you can see, a company of 12-pounders would require many more horses than one of smaller calibers. Napoleon kept the 6 regiments of horse artillery that he inherited from the Revolution, with each regiment containing 6 companies. Each company comprised of about 79 personnel, all armed with a sabre in the style of the cavalry. Although the Austrians, when they formed the first horse artillery, mounted the gunners on Wurst wagons, essentially an extra caisson designed to allow the gunners to ride it, the French had abandoned this idea, instead giving each gunner his own horse. Although this did require extra horses, and even men, for some would have to hold the horses of the others when dismounted, it was found to be much faster in terms of getting into action than the Wurst method. Horse artillery companies contained only 6 guns, rather than the 8 of the foot, usually grouped as 4 cannon and 2 howitzers, but could also simply be as 6 cannon. The caliber could vary coming into this period, with some regiments using the 4-pounder, whilst others had a liking for the heavier 8-pounder. The system of the year 11 was supposed to provide the compromise, and whilst in almost all cases the lighter howitzer was adopted, the 6-pounder cannon was less universally taken to during this period. The caisson and ammunition setup was identical to that of the foot, with one exception. All of their guns, regardless of caliber, were pulled by 6 horses in order to increase speed and mobility both on and off the battlefield. Again, like the foot regiments, their vehicles and guns were pulled by the train, but obviously the horses of the gunners themselves belonged to the horse artillery. The train d'artillerie was first formed in 1800, but by 1805 the number of battalions had expanded to 11, and during the next 3 years an additional 2 battalions would be added, with one more created in 1810. A battalion was commanded by a captain with a small staff, including an artiste vétérinaire, a master saddler, and a master armourer. A company by a lieutenant assisted by a sous-lieutenant. All companies had 2 blacksmiths and 2 harness makers. Each company would contain about 80 drivers, and initially each battalion contained 5 of these companies, but experience during its first campaign in 1800 proved that reorganisation was needed and a 6th company was added. One of these companies was classed as elite, given the pick of the battalion's horses and men, and then assigned to the horse artillery. 4 companies were assigned to the foot artillery, and a final depot company was used for training recruits and keeping remounts. As stated above, the train would be the ones to pull the guns into action, but they would also be responsible for pulling the various wagons that made up the artillery parks of each corps, including the extra caissons, field forges, supply wagons, and even spare cannon, with one estimation suggesting 1 spare was kept for every 10 guns in the field. These bridge builders were originally formed from the boatmen and ferrymen around Strasbourg in 1792, but became a formal regiment 2 years later. Although most felt that the pontonniers should be part of the engineers, Napoleon kept them separate and as a branch of the artillery, preferring their specialisation, and because the artillery arm had more resources in terms of personnel, horses, arsenals and workshops. The regiment was formed into 2 battalions, and in 1805 each battalion consisted of 8 companies. One company could put in a bridge of from 60 to 80 pontoons, very roughly 350 to 500 feet long, in 7 hours. Its pontoons, flat-bottomed, almost rectangular wooden boats sheathed with copper, were carried on haquettes, long 2-wheel carts, the front ends of which, like caissons, were attached to and supported by limbers. Other wagons carried the beams used to connect the pontoons, planks for the bridge flooring, rope and anchors for holding the bridge in place, small boats used in its construction, tools, clamps and spikes, and charcoal for the company field forge. Of course, if these materials were not available, then bridges could be improvised, the most famous example, and probably the finest moment for the pontonniers, being the crossing of the Berezina in 1812 during the retreat from Moscow, which, while saving much of the main army, cost the bridgemen severely. A single company of pontonniers would usually be assigned to each army corps, as well as to the cavalry reserve, the artillery park, and the guard. Ouvriers d'artillerie, or artificers, were responsible for the construction and repair of the artillery vehicles, and consequently worked in the arsenals, though during campaigns, companies would accompany the artillery parks. There were 15 companies of these important men during 1801, with that number increasing to 18 by 1810. A 19th company, consisting of volunteers from Spanish prisoners of war, was even added for the Russian campaign in 1812. The final branch of the artillery was the armourers, who repaired the weapons, and like the artificers served in the arsenals, or, when on campaign, would accompany the various artillery parks or remain in the depots. The first company was founded in 1803, and in November of 1805 2 more were added, each of which contained 2 officers and 50 men. To bring all of these branches together, Napoleon, when constructing and training La Grande Armée in the camps around Bologna, began to fully implement the corps system, replacing the divisional one which had stood before it. This topic will be discussed in much more detail during part 4 of the series, but for the artillery it was a key component to their organisation and battlefield functionality. If we take a look at Marshal Soult's 4th Corps from the Battle of Austerlitz, we can get a good indication of how artillery was supposed to operate within this system. As you can see, each division has its own company of artillery attached to it, the infantry having foot artillery, whilst the cavalry has horse artillery. In addition to this, there is also a corps artillery, which acts as a local reserve, and this houses the heavier guns, in this case 6 12-pounders. In this example, this setup gives the corps 35 guns to utilise in a variety of ways. For example, the divisional commanders could use the attached artillery in support of their own movements, whilst the 12-pounders play a reserve role, moving into action when and where they are required. Or perhaps all of the foot batteries, including the reserve, could be massed together to form a grand battery, coordinating their fire, in this case 30 guns, onto a key point in the enemy's line. There are obviously many other combinations that could be put into practice, but the point is that for the artillery, this core system was not only structured, but it also offered flexibility and initiative within this structure, enabling the commanders to react to whatever problems opposed them on their particular part of the battlefield. However, if we think back to the number of vehicles each artillery company required to operate, and then use Soult's Corps as an example, we can see that each foot company, presuming that they were armed with 6 or 8 pounders, would require 40 vehicles, and with 3 companies in total, plus the horse artillery and the Corps reserve, that brings the total to over 200 vehicles. Of course, the purpose of the Corps system was to enable both independence and manoeuvrability, with each forming essentially a small army. And having this many vehicles would seriously hamper this purpose, which is why a sensible solution was devised. When on campaign, therefore, an artillery company operated in 2 sections, one, in modern terms the firing battery, consisting of its guns and 1 caisson apiece, moved with the combat troops. The rest of the vehicles accompanied the artillery park. The idea of this method enabled the artillery to keep pace with the other arms, and if the Corps became engaged, the guns, with 1 caisson each, would have enough ammunition to operate until the park vehicles could catch up and supply additional ammunition if required. To further decrease the number of vehicles being held in one place, the park itself would be broken up into various components. First, each division would have its own park, then there would be a Corps park, then, when multiple corps were operating in unison, an army park, and finally a depot. Each of these parks contained various amounts of ammunition, all loaded into caissons or wagons, and therefore mobile, whilst the depot was the place where the caissons would be restocked after an action, as well as acting as a temporary arsenal and repair shop for the army. The idea of an artillery park was not unique to the French, but the concept of having this multi-park system, each with its own commander, does seem to be, and with Napoleon always insisting upon double ammunition for his artillery, this method helped to facilitate this, ensuring that, whilst plenty of ammunition was made available, it wasn't all kept in one place, running the risk of losing contact with the guns, nor was it all being dragged around by one park or with the companies. In addition and separate to the Corps, Napoleon also kept several companies aside to form an artillery reserve, ideally consisting of several batteries worth of 12-pounders and 6-inch howitzers. These would generally be attached to the main park and were always under Napoleon's personal control during a battle. In later campaigns, and as Napoleon expanded it, the artillery of his guard would form this reserve, and he would even create an exclusive train of the guard to accompany them. This became a much better way of organising the artillery in my opinion, as it not only kept the line regiments of both horse and foot attached to the corps and divisions, but it also meant that this reserve was now an elite cadre of hand-picked gunners and officers, and more than capable of being the decisive factor at the key moments in a battle. "It is the artillery of my guard," declared Napoleon, "which generally decides my battles, for, as I have it always at my hand, I can bring it to bear whenever it becomes necessary." However, the Guard began the period of La Grande Armée with only 2 companies of horse artillery, and although this would then grow to a full regiment of 6 companies in 1806, the foot regiment wasn't formed until 1808, therefore their impact in this period is not what it would be in later campaigns. How then did these various artillery companies function and manoeuvre on the battlefield? Unfortunately for the French, this is where we run into a bit of a stumbling block. There were no written French artillery regulations. The Guard finally had an unofficial set of rules published in 1812, but the French artillerymen were taught their doctrine in their schools and were constantly trained in its application. They also learned by experience. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find these Guard artillery regulations, nor have I managed to stumble across any diagrams or vivid descriptions of the various manoeuvres in the same way that I did for the infantry and cavalry. If anyone does know where I can find any of this information, then please let me know, as I'm very curious. With that said, however, I do believe that using other sources, we can attempt to piece together a general idea of what the French artillery would have done. To start with, one of the sources that I was able to look at was a manual for manoeuvres of British horse artillery dated 1835. However, before I simply use these as the basis for figuring out what it was the French potentially did, I want to share a few of my thoughts regarding them to clarify my thinking. Firstly, considering that both the cavalry and infantry regulations differed between the French and the British, it would be safe to assume that the artillery manoeuvres were not identical either. Secondly, when looking at these British regulations, there are a few points of contention that I have with them. The biggest of these regards the moment of deploying for action, so unlimbering the guns. This was what these regulations stipulated, and you can easily find videos of the King's Troop performing this procedure during their parade manoeuvres. However, I do not believe that this was what took place on the battlefield, at least not under optimum conditions anyway, and for several reasons. Firstly, to me at least, it makes no sense to unlimber the gun with the barrel facing away from the enemy, especially when the limber has to then come about in order to get out of the line of fire and take its place behind the gun. Would it not make far more sense to make this about face with the gun still attached, then unlimber the piece and immediately be ready for action? Fortunately, there is a combat example of the British horse artillery ignoring these regulations and in fact doing just this and reversing before unlimbering the piece. In his book Open Fire, B.P. Hughes quotes an officer giving instructions to his troop of horse artillery during a battle in the First Sikh Wars. "Now, my men, when at the gallop you see me drop the point of my sword, so go as if the devil was after you. When I raise it up, so pull up, and when I give the flourish, come about and unlimber." Those last few words, come about and then unlimber, seem key to me, and the fact that this action was conducted under constant fire shows that it certainly could be achieved. A manual on the Bengal horse artillery manoeuvres from 1837, whilst providing no in-depth descriptions or sketches on the actual procedure, does mention that when deploying for action, the limbers should be reversed, making sure to note that the horses should therefore be facing the rear before unlimbering the guns. A second key point to remember in regards to the French practices is the use of the prolongue. We know that this was regularly attached when in action, and it was also designed to enable the guns to be moved without the need of limbering up. Therefore, if the guns were to be moved in this fashion, the limber and towed gun would have to be reversed when arriving at the new position, otherwise the gun would be too far away and the prolongue would have to be detached. The limbers then reversed before reattaching it once more. This, to me, seems like wasted effort. It would also make sense to attach the prolongue immediately upon unlimbering, something which the British regulations wouldn't allow for. Finally, when the guns deployed for action, it would be the gun crew that unlimbered the piece, with the men of the train remaining mounted. Therefore, if the British method was used, the limber would have to remain stationary whilst the gunners either dismounted in the case of horse artillery, or simply caught up in the case of the footmen. However, both of these activities could take place whilst the limbers were reversing, reducing the time spent stationary for the limber if under fire. If you are able to watch the King's Troop perform this action, you can see that the crews are already in place and waiting for the guns to be brought forward before they unlimber them, something which wouldn't happen on the battlefield. Of course, I am not suggesting that the guns would exclusively unlimber with the barrels facing forwards, because there would be circumstances where space is restricted, and as the limbers without the guns have a smaller turning circle, unlimbering before turning would then make sense. However, generally I do believe that reversing before unlimbering would have been the desired doctrine, and the most efficient way of getting the guns into action. Guns were also placed much further apart than we see on many Hollywood films, with positions ideally picked to enable the guns to have about 15 to 20 yards between each other. Although mainly done for safety reasons, this would also give ample space for the limbers to come about with the guns attached. Another much smaller point of contention is that throughout these British regulations there is an insistence of the number one gun always being at the head and right side of the various columns, and there are in fact several inventive ways of manoeuvring to ensure that this was always the case. But once again, under battlefield conditions, this, it seems, was not a requirement. About 3 p.m, when Sir Augustus Fraser galloped up, crying, "Left, limber up, and fast as you can," the words were scarcely uttered when my gallant troops stood as desired in column of subdivisions, left in front, pointing towards the main ridge. This is taken from Captain Mercer's memoirs of the Battle of Waterloo, and as we can see, the battery was ployed into column, most likely via a simple pivot, and then moved off with the left gun in the lead, as this was the quickest way of getting to the new position. Therefore, I imagine that, much like the cavalry and infantry regulations, so long as the internal alignment of the guns was maintained, it didn't matter if the first or the last gun was the head of the column. This point also further heightens my suspicions that these British regulations may have seen use on the parade ground, but what took place on the battlefield could be entirely different. With all of that preamble out of the way, and yet with all of it in mind, the following then is what I believe were the most likely methods of manoeuvre for the French artillery. For ease of animation, I'm also using a 6-gun company, but it would be no different with more or less guns. Like the other arms, the artillery could function in several columns, the most common being the single file or semi-division column, of which the following manoeuvres could take place, starting with deploying into line and then readying for action. Firstly, when approaching the position from behind with the aim of deploying on the number 1 gun. Next, an identical scenario, but with the battery deploying on the number 6 gun. And I also think that it would be perfectly feasible to deploy on any of the guns within the battery, for example on the number 4 gun. When approaching the chosen position from the left, the guns would have to merely pivot 90 degrees to the right to be ready for action. When approaching from the right, the guns could just file into their position. When falling back to a new position, the guns could once again deploy on any of the guns, for example on the first. On the sixth. Or on the 4th gun. To form back into this semi-division column, it could be done in several ways depending on the direction required. Unless using the prolong to drag the piece, then of course the guns would have to be limbered up first, and without written regulations or detailed descriptions, I'm not 100% certain on how this was done. But with the limbers facing backwards, I believe that they would have just backed up towards the gun, with potentially the piece being dragged closer as well to speed things up. The British regulations have the limber riding up to meet the gun, which is then pulled around and limbered up, and this is possibly what took place. If so, then the prolong would have to be detached first, which is why I think that this is more of a parade ground operation. Regardless, using either the limber or the prolong, the manoeuvres would most likely be similar either way, but with the latter requiring more space. Firstly, deploying behind the number 1 gun, ready to move out. I imagine that a method of deploying forward similar to the one used by the French cavalry would also be possible. To move out to the right, then a simple left pivot would form this type of column. To move out to the left, this is where I believe that applying Mercer's logic makes the most sense, and rather than crossing over, simply having the left gun become the lead in the column requires a simple right pivot in order to form. Just to clarify that if a column was formed with the left leading, then deployment back into line would simply be a mirror of the method shown above. However, returning to forming column, if retreating, then using a method similar to the one used by the cavalry makes the most sense to me, and it could be done on either of the flank guns. The second most common form of column was the divisional column, formed with 2 guns. Ensuring that the guns remained internally aligned would prove slightly more difficult with this column, but a little logic suggests, in my opinion, some perfectly feasible methods. For example, deploying forwards into line on the right division. Deploying forwards on the left division. When approaching from the left, And when approaching from the right, this is slightly tricky and the spacing and timing would have to be correct. It's why I think the single file column would have been more commonplace, even if it is longer in length. When retreating and forming on the 1st Division, when retreating and forming on the 3rd Division, to ploy into this divisional column, the methods would be similar to the previous, and I'll just show one before explaining the others. Ploying on the 1st Division. This could be done with the left division leading as well, and could most likely be achieved using the advancing cavalry method. Forming this semi-divisional column to either the flanks or to the rear is where things get a little trickier, because to form it with the same alignment as it was going forwards, then the two guns within each division would have to switch places. This is especially problematic when retreating in this column, because the guns first have to switch to form the column, but they then have to switch back in order to redeploy into line. If they knew they were retreating to a new position and not just manoeuvring, then it would make sense to not switch the guns and to instead form the divisional column like this. But again, without regulations or good battlefield accounts, it is impossible to say for certain. I imagine that during battle, the most convenient method was probably the one that took place. There would also be a half-company column, which again would most likely use similar manoeuvres for deploying in and out of line. But, as can be imagined, these get even more complicated with the need to maintain internal alignment, which is why I believe that the semi-divisional column would have been the most common found on the battlefield, as it was the simplest to both form and deploy from. Especially when you consider that the French regularly used the prolongue to drag the guns behind to a new position, the simpler manoeuvres and columns make even more sense in my opinion. The company could of course also advance or retreat in line if space permitted. Whilst these animations show the guns limbering and unlimbering, the Spanish writer de Moira, in a book containing a philosophy for artillery usage published in 1816, emphasizes the movement of the guns by either hand or using the prolongue when in sight and range of the enemy, preferring not to waste time nor risk the horses by limbering up. These animations also tend to make things look perfectly uniform, and it should be remembered that the terrain would rarely allow for this, and the lines and spacing would vary in the field. The historian Haythornthwaite also believes that the guns would be drawn up in an irregular line, the alignment ideally staggered so that any enfilade fire would strike only one gun team at a time. This seems sensible, but would again be dependent upon the terrain and space of the chosen position. Whatever the means of manoeuvre, once deployed and unlimbered, the artillery company was now ready for action, and was henceforth commonly referred to as a battery. This could be further split down into smaller subunits, such as a half battery or a division, hence the single file column shown above being referred to as a semi-divisional column. Once in action, although the limbers would be close to the guns, the first line of caissons would be about 50 yards behind, preferably in cover, with the second line a further 50 behind that. This was to ensure the safety of the ammunition, and once one caisson was empty, it would ride to the rear whilst another rode forward to replace it. Some historians say that only one caisson was brought forward at a time, and used by all of the guns of the battery. Perhaps this was the case, but it must be remembered that the howitzers had a separate caisson for their ammunition, so at least two would have to be brought forward if this did take place. In the French artillery, the number of gunners varied according to the calibre of the piece, and they were assisted by infantrymen attached to the crew to keep the loader supplied and to manhandle the piece. The 12-pounder had 8 gunners and 7 infantrymen, the 8-pounder 8 and 5, the 4-pounder 6 and 4 respectively. The actual operation of the piece was handled by the gunners, though there are examples of the infantry being roped in to replace wounded members during battles, but with a fully operational crew, the firing protocol for a French gun would be as follows. If previously fired, then the gun would first be rammed back into its position using the bricoles and handspikes. Then, when the word load is called, the second cannoneer, using a leather glove on his left hand, covers the vent hole, whilst his right hand adjusts the elevation of the piece, using the screw underneath the barrel. It would be the first cannoneer who would direct him in this, whilst also aiming the piece using the trail handspikes. With the vent hole covered, the first matro on the right could then clean out the barrel using the wet sponge end of the rammer. This was done to ensure that no smouldering fibres from the previous discharge were left, which could potentially prematurely ignite the next charge. Once this is complete, the first matro on the left can then load the cartridge, pushing it into the barrel, ensuring that the powder bag is at the bottom. The sponge man then reverses the rammer, and together with the loader, they ram the cartridge firmly down the barrel. With the round in place, the second matro on the left steps forward and pushes a metal wire down the vent hole, piercing the charge bag, before then placing a priming tube down the vent into it, and giving the order fire. This priming tube was filled with a quick-fire charge, a combination of ground gunpowder with either brandy or spirits and made into a paste. The tube itself was made of reed, and once thoroughly cleaned and cut to the correct size, it was filled with this paste and left to dry. Once made, they had a shelf life of up to 10 years, and both the second matro on either side carried a belt of them. With all of this complete, the gun was now ready to fire, and all the crew ensured that they were away from the gun and out of its recoil path. Then, the second matro on the right ignites the quick-fire reed with his port fire, ensuring to step out of the way before the charge is triggered and the gun roars to life. As the gun fires, the first cannoneer will watch the fall of the shot, being sure to stand upwind of the gun if possible, before the process is then repeated. Each gun within the battery would fire like this, with the fire moving from right to left across the battery with a small delay between each shot, the idea being that by the time the final gun is fired, the first will now be reloaded and ready to repeat the cycle. Although without regulations to verify, it seems plausible that, like the infantry, a battery could also conduct its fire by the various subunits, for example, by division. By half battery, or as a full volley, probably something only done when pressed close by the enemy and as a last resort. This firing protocol would be identical no matter what type of ammunition was being fired, and both the cannon and howitzers had two options in that regard. The primary and most recognisable type of ammunition fired by artillery of this period was known as ball, round shot, or sometimes solid shot, and it was fired exclusively by the cannons, the size of which would vary depending upon the calibre of the gun. In the picture you can see this is an example of fixed ammunition, with the powder bag and ball both attached to the wooden sabot. The range of round shot would depend once again upon the calibre of the gun, with a 12-pounder capable of throwing the projectile an estimated 2,200 yards, compared to the 6-pounders 1,900 yards. The practical effective range of these weapons would be lower, however. It should also be noted that the difference in calibre didn't just affect the range of the piece, but its general effectiveness and damage potential of the various ranges. There was little difference between the muzzle velocities of all the guns used in the field, but the heavier the shot, the greater was its remaining velocity, that is, its velocity at the target. Whilst direct fire was common, a tactic that most associate with round shot was ricochet fire, the idea being that the shot would not be aimed directly at the enemy, but at a point just in front of them. Ideally, the ball would then strike the ground and bounce into the enemy, and could keep on bouncing and rolling for a fairly large distance, once again with the larger calibers having more velocity in this regard. It was felt that this method impacted enemy morale more than direct fire did, and it also probably helped with accuracy, as shots that fell short could still bounce into the enemy, and rounds that overshot might simply end up as direct fire. Of course, this was an ideal scenario, and because battlefields are rarely flat, even plains, the bounce of these shots would be unpredictable, and if the cannon's elevation was too high, then the shots would simply bury themselves rather than bouncing. The state of the ground also had an effect, with wet or boggy ground slowing or stopping the ball much quicker than a hard, solid surface would. The exclusive round of the howitzer was known as shell, and consisted of a round hollow ball filled with gunpowder. A fuse was attached, and once fired, the shell would ideally land amongst the enemy before then exploding. If this fuse was not cut to the correct length, then the shell would either go off prematurely, or, once landed, take too long to explode, allowing the enemy to get out of its blast radius. There are even some examples of brave men stepping forward and pulling the fuse out of spinning shells that landed near them. Nonetheless, these shells were still effective, and the slight lobbing nature of the howitzers allowed them to be directed over hills and buildings into areas that cannons struggled to reach. These shells were especially useful for driving enemies out of built-up areas, where their explosive nature often set fire to the buildings. The third and final projectile used by the French was known as case or canister, and could be fired by both types of gun, with the howitzer in fact being regarded as slightly better for this type of ammunition. Canister consisted of a metallic case filled with musket balls of different sizes and quantities, depending upon the type being used. The French had two types, heavy and light. Its range was also much greater than many believe, with 800 yards being the maximum range for heavy canister fired from a 12-pounder. Of course, given that the casing would break and the balls scatter upon firing, the effect was similar to that of a shotgun, meaning that its effectiveness would decrease with range. In spite of this, the French would regularly fire canister at ranges beyond that of which their adversaries would, often firing as soon as the target was within about 500 yards, sometimes even earlier. Canister is sometimes, even in memoirs, wrongly referred to as grape, which was in fact a different type of ammunition mainly used during naval warfare. Some sources hint at its use on the battlefield, but munitions lists for the French, and most other armies of the period, only ever refer to ball, shell and case, and considering that grape shot was renowned for damaging the barrels of bronze guns when used, it is safe to assume that it probably wasn't common. As a small side note, something occasionally referred to in memoirs was double slotting the gun. This meant that both canister and round shot were loaded simultaneously, though I did come across a few sources suggesting that double canister was also fired in this method. I only raise this point because, as we've seen, fixed ammunition was commonplace at this point, with the charge being already attached to the shot. Therefore, if double slotting, it could potentially be dangerous to have two charges in the barrel. Maybe this danger was just ignored, but I imagine that they either used loose cannonballs, or perhaps it was easy to detach the cartridge bags to enable this mode of firing. Baron Thibault, writing about a close-range encounter on the Pratzen Heights during the Battle of Austerlitz, mentions ordering the artillery under his command to use this tactic. I bade Major Fortenay load all the guns with round and grape, and to his remark that this would ruin them, I added, "It will be all right if they last 10 minutes." Major Fortenay's remark that this method would damage the guns perhaps does indicate that they left both charges attached, but, and as I'm sure you've guessed by now, without written regulations and with sadly few memoirs by artillerymen, it is difficult to figure out exactly what went on, but it would seem that this tactic was definitely used. I felt that it was important to discuss the actual effectiveness of artillery, because I think that there are a few misconceptions regarding its true impact. The first of these is the actual rate of fire of the guns once in action. Theoretically, the guns could fire up to 3 rounds a minute, but in actuality this was reduced, both to conserve ammunition and to ensure that the correct protocols were carried out by the crew. Between 20 and 30 rounds per hour was probably the norm for sustained fire, with the tempo increasing before an attack was launched. The rate of fire would also likely, and understandably, increase when under attack. However, even at the lower estimate of 20 rounds an hour, this is still per gun, and is thus a lot of ammunition being expended. At Wagram, for example, the French fired over 100,000 rounds, and yet the figures for the Austrians killed and wounded during the 2-day ordeal was less than a quarter of that, and of course not all of these would have been inflicted by the artillery. The reason for this discrepancy is that, although in theory a cannonball could smash through several ranks of men, inflicting multiple casualties, the reality was very different, simply because the accuracy of artillery during this period was nowhere near perfect, and for good reasons. Whilst Gribeauval had finally provided better sights for his guns, the aiming was still done using the naked eye, and because of the recoil, each piece would have to be relayed and re-aimed before every shot. To make things worse, the smoke generated by not only their own battery firing, but by the general happenings of the battle itself, often made visibility difficult. Finally, when these factors are combined with a smooth bore barrel that lacked rifling grooves, it isn't surprising that the accuracy for both a 12 and 6 pounder at ranges just under 1,000 yards come out at less than 25%, a figure that would likely drop further under battlefield conditions. Another factor influencing this general effectiveness of artillery was the terrain over which the battle was fought. As mentioned in the ricochet section, the state of the ground could affect the impact of the shots, but the topography of it could also impact the ability for artillery to even fire upon troops. Cannon had a fairly flat trajectory, and could therefore not fire over obstacles of any significant height, meaning that troops on reverse slopes, behind woods, or even behind buildings were relatively safe from their fire. Whilst howitzers, as mentioned, could hit these troops, their numbers were much lower than cannon, and both accuracy and timing of the fuse was not reliable. Despite artillery doing less physical damage than many might imagine, this does not mean that it was ineffective. In fact, far from it. If used correctly and concentrating fire upon similar targets, or simply firing at shorter ranges, then it absolutely could inflict horrific numbers of casualties, and there are many examples of this taking place throughout the Napoleonic Wars. However, arguably artillery's most impactful role remained one of its earliest, that of influencing morale. As discussed in a previous video, one of the biggest factors determining battlefield success was morale, with the idea being to break that of the enemy whilst maintaining your own. There were many factors and events that took place on a battlefield that could influence this morale factor, both positively and negatively, and artillery played a crucial role in both. Napoleon's understanding of artillery would have made him well aware of the material ineffectiveness of light battalion guns, yet he also knew that seeing and hearing friendly artillery firing upon the enemy raised the morale of the troops, which is why he sought to reinstate them in 1809, and only a shortage of horses after 1812 forced him to abandon the idea once again. While seeing friendly guns firing upon the enemy may have boosted morale, being under bombardment had the complete opposite effect. One of the greatest trials of patience was to look on passively at a cannonade which was pretty lively. Many diaries and life stories from modern conflicts mention the terror of being under an artillery bombardment, the feeling of hopelessness and the lack of control over one's destiny, all aided by the noise and confusion of explosions. Whilst the Napoleonic era bombardment may not have had the same accuracy or power as modern artillery, it was still a terrifying ordeal, for the men could not dig trenches or foxholes, and remained in ordered formations to endure such frights. Good generals, therefore, knew how to utilize this morale factor of artillery to their advantage, and used it to cause not just material, but also psychological damage to their opponents. As another side note, I thought it would be prudent to mention the myths surrounding ducking or dodging out of the way of incoming artillery. There is unfortunately a romantic notion that men of those days would simply stand and take a hit from a cannonball, rather than be seen as a coward for getting out of its way, but I don't believe that this was the case, and neither does the historian Moore. Bobbing or ducking was all but universal, and many memoirists and letter writers refer quite naturally to it without the least hint of shame. One British officer even tells of pulling a near-sighted comrade out of the way of an approaching ball, while so vain a man as Captain Francois had no hesitation in writing that, despite my wounded leg, I did as well as my voltigeurs in jumping out of the way of round shot which ricocheted into our ranks. Certainly many of the men were brave, that is not in question. To be in any war requires a certain level of courage, and walking towards canister or an awaiting infantry volley no doubt required copious amounts of it. This is also not to say that the men never put themselves in danger. They absolutely did, and there are many examples of officers leading from the front and braving the fire of the enemy to inspire their men. However, if they saw a cannonball bouncing towards them, then of course they would get out of the way. Same if a howitzer shell landed nearby, they would move away from it. It is one thing to face danger, and another to just accept death as it comes towards you when there is a chance of avoiding it. There is a difference, in my opinion, in remaining stoic under fire and simply being stupid. Remaining in formation or stationary whilst under fire was desired and in most cases the norm, and one thinks of the famous quote by General Lepie to his grenadiers à cheval of the Old Guard at the Battle of Eylau, ordering them to keep their heads up despite the incoming fire. However, I think that even General Lepie would move out of the way if he could see a cannonball coming directly for him, nor would he chastise his men for doing the same. Avoiding danger is a natural instinct that is difficult to override. It also just makes absolutely no sense to allow needless casualties if they can be avoided, firstly because it weakens the unit, but also, and perhaps more importantly, it crushes morale. Seeing comrades getting hit can break even the toughest of soldiers, and forcing them to endure that seems to me like madness. I believe that Moore is right, and that the logical conclusion is that, yes, the men were absolutely stoic under fire, and would endure an artillery barrage stood in ranks, but if they could see the shots coming towards them, then they would definitely get out of the way, before getting back into formation, probably joking in a typical army-style dark humour about how much of a close call it was. There is a reason that Wellington allowed his men to lie down behind the crest at Waterloo, and it wasn't for a quick nap. It maintained unit strength, kept up morale, and probably endeared him somewhat to the men themselves. This fact also goes a little way into further explaining the general lack of effectiveness of artillery in causing the mass casualties, particularly at longer ranges, that the number of shots fired would suggest. It also shows why both column and square formations were especially vulnerable to artillery fire, not just because of their size, but also because the men towards the rear of these formations would not be able to see the shots coming, and would therefore be at the mercy of chance alone for their survival. Therefore, perhaps a suitable conclusion for artillery's effectiveness can be offered to us by Moore. Artillery played many roles in battle, providing close support for beleaguered infantry, bombarding an enemy-held village, being rushed from reserve to fill a gap in the line, silencing troublesome enemy guns, or giving cavalry an element of firepower. But the broadest, most consistent role was to begin the process of eroding the enemy's strength, both by inflicting casualties and by wearing away the morale and cohesion of enemy units. Softening up the enemy, curiously gentle words for a brutal, bloody reality. Finally, to answer the question, was the French artillery arm as dominant as its comrades in the cavalry and infantry? The answer, I believe, is a resounding yes. Although the forming of the larger Grand batteries may not have occurred until after this period, the French artillery of La Grande Armée still held the edge over their adversaries, and for several good reasons. The first is that, despite the mixing of the Gribeauval and Year 11 systems, the French guns were still of a very high quality, and often superior to those of their opponents. In comparing with the French, the historian Keeley notes that the Austrian field artillery was significantly inferior in terms of throw weight per class of gun, and this was more keenly felt as the calibers increased in size. This meant that the French guns could outrange their Austrian counterparts, a distinct advantage even before any tactics came into play. However, this advantage was not just in terms of power, but also in manoeuvrability and organisation. It is of no surprise that in the various reforms made by the Allied nations after being defeated by La Grande Armée, they adopted a system similar to Gribeauval's. It must be remembered, however, that the Gribeauval guns had been around for several decades at this point, and yet the revolutionary troops used them with markedly less success than those of the Empire. Therefore, it wasn't simply a technical edge which set the French ahead of their rivals. Developments in artillery were not concerned with technical aspects, but with organisation and tactics. Owing to the skill and energy of its commanders and the courage of its gunners, the French artillery victoriously asserted itself, despite the superiority in numbers of enemy batteries. As Jobe correctly points out, it was once again in the realm of tactics and leadership where the French found their true advantages, though it wasn't quite as straightforward as it first seems. In terms of tactics, as discussed earlier, two of the most influential figures in regards to the artillery were Guibert and Du Teil, both of whom published their work prior to the Revolution. Their ideas were therefore well known in French military circles, and, as evidenced by Napoleon's education, many of these tactical theories would have been taught at military academies and schools. It was in these places where artillery officers learnt their trade, and the standard of the French artillery schools had always been regarded as some of Europe's finest ever since the first one was officially established around 1720. These standards were also kept high by two of their most prominent artillery chiefs. Firstly, by Valliere's insistence on a school curriculum that included mechanical drawing and mathematical theory, and then continued under Gribeauval's influence. Gribeauval's continuation on the insistence of an excellent educational background became the hallmark of the French artillery schools up to 1789. He emphasised that training had to be balanced between the academic or theoretical and the practical. Once artillery officers had been commissioned, they would spend the first 9 weeks with their regiments as enlisted men, learning crew drill and the other duties of enlisted French artillerymen. Lastly, he opened an artillery school for French NCOs, so that their education would not be neglected. Not as extensive as the officers' schooling, it was still a step in the right direction. Gribeauval also ventured into training for officers and NCOs, professional schools and employment doctrine. He was instrumental in sponsoring the new artillery doctrine of close and continuous artillery cooperation with the infantry, which was one of the cornerstones of the new French tactical system. The well-rounded nature that this education provided no doubt inspired Napoleon to conclude the following: I believe every officer ought to serve in the artillery, which is the arm that can produce most of the good generals. Despite this, the revolutionaries in 1793 actually disbanded some of the Royal Artillery schools, something Napoleon immediately reversed upon becoming First Consul. This disbandment cannot, however, explain the mixed performance of the arm during the Revolutionary Wars, because many of the officers who would go on to make names for themselves under the Empire had already graduated prior to this point. Therefore, with the schools, officers, tactics, and Gribeauval system already in place, the Revolutionary Wars should have marked the coming of age for French artillery, much like it did for the infantry. There were certainly glimpses, particularly the dare and aggression of the horse artillery, and Napoleon of course had shown the potential of what the arm was truly capable of, but generally the artillery remained firmly as a supportive element, without the dominance that would become apparent under the period of the Empire. The missing ingredient, the thing that brought all of these factors together and finally allowed the artillery to flourish, was implemented by Napoleon upon the creation of La Grande Armée, and that was the corps system. As mentioned in the earlier sections, the corps provided flexibility within a workable system, each acting as a self-contained army with enough artillery to handle most situations that it came across. However, it was the direction of the artillery that placed the French ahead of their rivals, and the corps system emphasized this factor brilliantly. The organization of French artillery was second to none. Each French corps had an artillery chief, a general officer who worked for the corps commander. This artillery general had his own staff, headed by a chief of staff who was also an artilleryman. It was just plain common sense to have an artillery general as a corps or army artillery chief. One general talking to another is quite different from a senior field-grade officer trying to convince a skeptical infantry general on the best use of his artillery. Prior to the corps system, the artillery attached to the various divisions, be them infantry or cavalry, would be under the command of the divisional commander, who in most cases would not be an artillery officer and would therefore lack the understanding to properly utilize them. The handling of artillery was regarded as a specialist skill by Du Teil, who, when writing on the seemingly simple process of choosing a gun position, noted that it is necessary, in order to fulfill this objective, that the officers possess a refined skill in recognizing terrain, because with the artillery, that skill is of the greatest importance. He also mentioned the importance in recognizing potential fields of fire, understanding the time required to move in and out of a position, as well as potential routes for doing so, all skills which the educated artillery officers under this divisional commander would possess, but very often being of inferior rank, their opinions on these matters were rarely listened or adhered to. There would usually be an artillery general attached to the army, who held command over the reserve artillery, and whilst he could bring some of the divisional guns under his command, commanding the artillery of an entire army was impossible for one man, especially as the number of guns increased. This is where the corps system truly offered an almost perfect balance, because not only did each have enough guns to make a serious impact upon an engagement, but they were now under the command of a senior artillery officer who would know how to use them. There were senior artillery commanders in the French army at army, corps, and usually also divisional levels, and those commanders were each served with a small staff. They were in close touch with the formation commander whom they were supporting, and the whole arrangement was well suited to provide efficient direction and control of the guns. The French artillery schools had always produced good officers, and the prospect of promotion based upon merit, spirited by the revolution, pushed the better of these men towards the top, but it wasn't until the implementation of the corps system that they were finally able to shine. Instead of one senior artillery officer with the entire army, there was now one with each corps, and this decentralizing of command offered the independence and responsibility which had already seen the infantry and cavalry excel. Whilst the Allied artillery were shackled by an outdated command structure which limited them to a mere supporting and usually defensive role, the French artillery officers utilized their newfound freedom to finally practice the tactics of Guibert and Du Teil, stressing movement and concentration of firepower. It was not necessary or even desirable for the cannon to be concentrated in dense groups. Although their fire should be concentrated on the same objective, the batteries themselves should be separate, operating from different directions so as to disperse the enemy's artillery fire. Although it would be the senior officers directing and selecting targets for this concentration of fire, the independence and responsibility granted by the system naturally trickled down, instilling confidence into the junior ranks and boosting an already established esprit de corps. Officers, even in the artillery, frequently led from the front and still embodied an essence of that revolutionary spirit which had seen the horse artillery to such early success. Whilst the guns themselves were definitely valued, it was their destructive capabilities and impact which were regarded as more important, and this saw them deployed far more aggressively than those of their opponents. In combat, artillery positions were fought to the last, and the guns saved if at all possible. So although French commanders would hazard their guns to win an advantage, and continually put their guns as close to the enemy as practicable in support of their own infantry, they would fight to the bitter end in their weapons defence. Crucially, and thanks to this system, because the senior artillery officers could now take a more active and involved role in the tactical discussions and considerations that took place at a corps level, it also allowed for far better coordination between all three arms. The French developed more than artillery doctrine for the fighting of their guns. They also developed a definite command structure for artillery that mirrored the tactical and grand tactical developments with the infantry and cavalry. They undoubtedly had the most highly developed command structure, as well as the most flexible tactical system of the period. Finally, and almost as the icing upon the cake, it must be remembered that leading the French armies in many of the major battles during this period was Napoleon, himself a proven master of artillery, and whilst he usually left small-scale tactical matters to his more than capable subordinates, at times he would personally intervene in the placement of guns or choice of targets, often to devastating effect. This period of the Grand Armée was not the peak for the French artillery arm, and many of its greatest feats were accomplished in the later wars of the Empire. However, there are still a few noteworthy incidents during our period, and one in particular that comes at the climax. During the Battle of Austerlitz, the artillery operated in perfect coordination with the other two arms all across the field. Although outnumbered in guns, the French utilised what they had with great efficiency, even when split into smaller subunits. On the southern flank of the battle, for example, 250 men of the 2nd Battalion of the 26th Legers, attempting to hold the Solkonitz castle against over 2,000 Russians, was supported by just 2 guns, which they put to great effect. Despite their experience, there was little the soldiers of this tiny garrison could do in the circumstances, and they withdrew before the Russians were able to surround them. The retiring light infantry fell back on the main body of their battalion west of the castle, and once they had cleared the field of fire, the 2 artillery pieces opened up with canister on the disorganized mass below them. This fire added to the disorder, and the Legers charged forward and drove the bewildered Russians back. Meanwhile, on the Pratzen Heights, we have a great example from Baron Thibault, commanding the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division as part of Soult's Corps, in the mobility and proactivity that the French artillery could enjoy, when he received quick fire support in order to repel a menacing counterattack by the enemy. Morin was using 3 of the guns belonging to the division, so I placed the 3 others between the 2 battalions of the 36th, but just then Major Fontenay brought us 6 12-pounders by order of the Emperor, who judged how serious our position was getting. These I placed 3 and 3 on each wing of the 36th, and with my line thus bristling at 3 points, I masked my guns with squads of infantry and galloped off at full speed to reconnoitre the newcomers. Having thus utilised every moment, I let the formidable masses approach to the appointed distance, and then my 9 guns, abruptly unmasked, and my whole line poured in one of the most destructive fires ever seen. Finally, with the heights secured and the outcome of the battle no longer in doubt, a 30-gun battery was established to punish the now isolated left wing of the Allied army, helping to complete its destruction and ensure that the French victory was decisive. At Jena the following year, perhaps the most famous artillery incident actually occurred on the night prior to the battle, where Napoleon, regressing from emperor back to a simple captain, personally assisted the movement of an artillery company which had gotten stuck in a ravine, mistaking it for a road in the darkness. By torchlight and with a few simple orders, Napoleon helped them to reverse their limbers and got them moving again up to the plateau, some of the soldiers not realizing who exactly it was who was helping them. The next day, during the battle, the artillery once again proved its worth. The guns that Napoleon helped had formed part of a grand battery on the Langgrafenberg, the high ground from which it covered Lannes' initial attack which secured the ground on which the Grand Army was to deploy. The battle then went back and forth, with the Prussians throwing back the French in several areas, but by 1 p.m. the French were deployed, and Napoleon prepared the definitive strike. All across the front, French artillery aggressively moved forward into canister range, signalling the start of the main French attack. Soon enough, and with their position rapidly becoming untenable, the Prussians sounded the retreat. At first this went well enough, covered by Prussian and Saxon cavalry, but again French artillery firing in mass broke the cohesion of the covering force. Once more the Grand Armée was victorious, and the artillery had again proven its worth and superiority over its opponents. In 1807, the Battle of Eylau proved to be a rare setback for this great army, including the artillery, and it was in fact the Russian 70-gun Grand battery that inflicted the most damage, practically decimating Augereau's 7th Corps when the French soldiers emerged from a snowstorm less than 100 yards to its front. The 15 minutes of point-blank carnage that followed proved to be the key turning point of the battle, costing Napoleon any chance of victory. Fortunately for the French, 4 months later they would have their revenge, and this period of La Grande Armée was to end on a high at the Battle of Friedland, with the artillery playing a key role, particularly General Saint-Amand. With Benningsen foolishly positioning his army with their backs to a river, Napoleon seized the opportunity, and around 5 p.m, 3 sharp blasts from the reserve artillery signalled the commencement of the main attack by Ney's 6th Corps on the right. However, the Russians proved to be as tough an opponent as ever, and the attack began to stall as counterattacks and artillery fire slowed the momentum of the attack. Thankfully, artillery was quickly brought forward, and their fire soon silenced their Russian counterparts on the opposite bank, helping to relieve the pressure on Ney's corps and restart the advance. It was to be in the centre, however, where the true artillery highlight was to occur. Seeing the attack once again stutter and the flank of 6th Corps threatened, General Dupont, as part of Victor's 1st Corps, had ordered forward his division on his own initiative, an effective decision later praised by Napoleon. 1st Corps' Chief of Artillery, General Saint-Amand, spoke to General Victor and asked for permission to utilise all of the Corps' artillery to support Dupont's movements. With the request granted, Saint-Amand ordered 6 guns to be held in reserve, while he divided the other 30 into 2 batteries, placing 15 on either side of the road, about 450 yards from the Russian lines. Ordering them to deploy for action, they opened fire with round shot. Although inflicting damage on the Russian centre, Saint-Amand was not yet satisfied, and he ordered the right battery to move forward, whilst the left maintained the bombardment. Once within 250 yards, he halted the men and ordered them to commence firing, this time with canister, whilst he rode back to order the left battery to move forward. This manoeuvre he repeated with each battery leapfrogging the other until they were between 100 to 150 yards away. At this range they couldn't miss, and the Russian centre promptly disintegrated. The entire manoeuvre in just over 20 minutes had left 4,000 Russians killed or wounded on the field, a devastating example of the capabilities of well-led artillery. Saint-Amand's artillery attack at Friedland was the first time artillery had been used as an independent manoeuvre element on the battlefield in an offensive role. They provided the impetus and casualties that turned the fight in favour of the French. It should be noted that the infantry supported Saint-Amand's guns, which was a reversal of roles. The independence of the artillery, no longer acting as merely a supporting piece, was a sign of what was to come in the wars that followed. This artillery charge would be used by probably the greatest artillery general of the age, Drouot, on a grander scale at the Battle of Lutzen in 1813, where he pushed around 100 guns forward, again in coordinated leaps, paving the way for the final and decisive attack by the Guard. The Napoleonic Wars were in many ways the first real artillery wars, as it is arguably the moment when the artillery proved itself to be more than just a supporting element. It would be the French who would pioneer this new approach, and its origins began prior to the Revolution. It was the Ancien regime who gave Gribeauval free rein to reorganize the artillery, producing a system which armed the French with the best and most mobile guns in Europe. The tactical theories of both Guibert and Du Teil had also emerged from these pre-evolutionary military circles, the same theatre which saw the infantry tactics make huge strides. However, unlike the infantry, the Revolutionary Wars did not see the emergence of French artillery dominance, and, despite a few bright sparks, it would take a new system to enable these tactical theories to become practical reality. One bright spark was certainly Napoleon, who, as an officer, had proved how effective the French guns and new ideas could be, but as first consul, his structural changes would finally unlock the potential of the entire artillery. Firstly, the militarization of the artillery train not only unified gunner and driver, but it relieved the transportation problems often faced during the Revolutionary Wars. Secondly, and most importantly, the implementation of the corps system promoted a sensible command structure and artillery organisation, both of which enabled the French guns to outshoot their opponents, even when frequently outnumbered. The high standard of the French artillery schools had always produced good artillery officers, and whilst the revolution allowed the best of these men to rise the ranks, it was the corps system that offered them the staging to finally influence battles with their leadership and tactical prowess. Like their infantry and cavalry counterparts, these men were brave and imaginative, using their guns in an aggressive manner synonymous with the French during this period. Names such as Saint-Amand, Elbe, Drouot and Lauriston would become famous for their artillery actions, whilst others such as Marmont and Foy would even go on to become successful generals of combined arms forces. Although the majority of the great feats and massed battery actions of the French artillery came in the period following the one being discussed here, it must be remembered that because of the overall quality of La Grande Armée, the artillery wasn't required to do as much heavy lifting as it would later on. To quote Napoleon, "The less good troops are, the more artillery they require. There are corps d'armée with which I should require only 1/3 of the artillery which would be necessary with others." With exceptional infantry and cavalry, the artillery was not required to perform to the standards that it would in later periods, but even still it proved a formidable force on the battlefield, earning mimicry and respect from her adversaries. The European powers at war with France, subjected to the superiority of her artillery, subsequently adopted the French methods of organisation, the Gribeauval type ordnance, and its tactics. Writing after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, which brought peace and signalled the end of La Grande Armée's tour of Europe, a commander of a Russian artillery brigade, General Sivert, who had witnessed the handling of French artillery throughout the period, made the following comments in his final report. French artillery equipment was not better than that of the Russians, but French commanders used their artillery more skillfully. They chose better positions for artillery batteries, and the actions of their whole army helped their artillery to be more effective. The Napoleonic Wars were perhaps the high watermark for French artillery, and although the peak may have been during the later years of conflict, it was during the period of La Grande Armée that the waters truly began to rise. Until next time, thanks for watching.